Hey everyone, welcome back to Unseen Anthology. I'm Jamie, and today I want to share a story that's been haunting me ever since it happened. It's not something I talk about often, but it's one of those experiences that lingers in the back of your mind, refusing to let go. It all began with a message one that arrived just when I'd nearly given up hope. I'd been on the hunt for a quiet retreat, a place far from the city's constant noise. Somewhere I could finally focus on my art. Every listing I found was either outrageously expensive or vanished before I could even schedule a viewing. Then, late one stormy evening, my phone buzzed with an alert. Secluded Victorian manor, priced to move, immediate occupancy. The price was almost unbelievable for a sprawling estate with acres of untouched woodland. The listing was barely an hour old, but I didn't hesitate. I dialed the number, and a calm, almost distant voice answered. When I asked about seeing the property, there was a brief silence before she replied. The Ashcroft House is available, but you should know it's being sold as is. The family wants a swift sale. I pressed for details. The previous owner passed away recently, she explained. The heirs are out of the country and want nothing to do with it. It sounded ideal, maybe too ideal. I arranged a visit for the following morning. The manor was tucked away, hidden by ancient oaks, as if the world had forgotten it existed. As I turned onto the winding drive, the house emerged from the mist. Straight out of a Victorian ghost story, the Ashcroft House stood before me. 3 stories of faded elegance, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of years and secrets. The gingerbread trim, once painted a cheerful white, was now chipped and gray, curling like old parchment. As I stepped from my car, the air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and something older, something that seemed to seep from the very bones of the house. The real estate agent, a tall, angular woman with a severe bob and a navy raincoat, waited at the edge of the gravel drive. She introduced herself as Ms. Hargrove, her handshake brisk and cool. I noticed she kept glancing at the house, as if wary of getting too close. She gestured for me to go ahead, her voice tight. "You'll want to see it for yourself. I'll wait here, if you don't mind." "Allergies," she added, though her eyes didn't water and her nose wasn't red. I shrugged, more curious than concerned, and made my way up the creaking steps. The front door, heavy oak with a stained glass window, groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and still, carrying the scent of old wood, dust, and a faint sweetness that reminded me of rotting apples. The foyer was grand, if faded, with a sweeping staircase that curved up into shadow. To my right, a parlor with tall windows and a marble fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. To my left, a dining room with a long table draped in a moth-eaten cloth. Chairs pushed back, as if the last meal had ended in a hurry. I wandered through the rooms, guided by Ms. Hargrove's muffled directions from outside. The kitchen was a time capsule, with a cast-iron stove and a sink stained by decades of use. A pantry door hung open, revealing empty shelves and a single, dusty jar of preserves. Upstairs, the bedrooms were large and drafty, their wallpaper peeling in long strips. In the master bedroom, a 4-poster bed stood sentinel, its canopy draped in yellowed lace. The other rooms were empty, save for a few forgotten toys and a cracked mirror propped against the wall. On the 3rd floor, I found 2 smaller rooms, quarters, perhaps, and a narrow door leading to the attic. I hesitated, the memory of those footsteps from my first night echoing in my mind, but curiosity won out. The attic was vast and cluttered, filled with trunks, broken furniture, and boxers stacked haphazardly. In the far corner, a small door, newer than the rest, was secured with a heavy padlock. I made a mental note to return with tools. For now, I descended, my excitement growing. The house was in rough shape, but it felt right, as if it had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. When I stepped outside, Ms. Hargrove was on her phone, her back to the house. She ended her call quickly when she saw me. "Well?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I'll take it," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. For a moment, her expression flickered relief, maybe, or something like regret, but she recovered quickly. "The Ashcroft heirs will be pleased," she said. "They're eager to finalize the sale. If you can close quickly, I'm sure they'll accept an offer below asking." The whole process felt rushed, as if the family couldn't wait to be rid of the place. But I was too caught up in the dream of owning such a house to question it. The closing was a blur. I never met the heirs. Everything was handled through a lawyer, a nervous man named Mr. Lyle, who seemed eager to finish the paperwork. When I asked about the house's history, he deflected, saying only that it had been in the family for generations. The only odd moment came when he slid a non-disclosure agreement across the table. "Just a formality," he said, not meeting my eyes. "The family values their privacy." I signed, thinking little of it. 2 weeks later, I moved in. The first days were a whirlwind of unpacking and cleaning. I set up my studio in the sunroom, dragging in an old desk and a battered armchair. The house had no internet, and my phone barely got a signal, but I found the isolation oddly comforting. This was what I'd wanted: a place to work, to think, to start over. But on my 4th night, as I lay in bed reading, I heard it, footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, crossing the attic floor. I froze, heart pounding, listening as the steps paused, then resumed, moving from one end of the house to the other. The house was old, prone to creaks and groans, but these were unmistakably footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and crept upstairs, the boards cold beneath my feet. The attic door was ajar, the padlock hanging loose. I shone my light into the darkness, calling out, but there was only silence, thick and expectant. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. That night, sleep was slow to come, and when it did, my dreams were filled with the sound of footsteps and the faint, sweet scent of rotting apples. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the laced curtains, painting shifting patterns on the floorboards. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, telling myself it was just nerves in the unfamiliarity of a new place. But as I made coffee in the kitchen, I noticed something odd. A faint trail of dust disturbed on the stairs, as if someone or something had walked from the attic down to the 2nd floor. I followed the trail, heart thumping, but it faded near the master bedroom. There was nothing out of place, no sign of an intruder, but the sense of being watched lingered. Determined to distract myself, I decided to explore the grounds. The property stretched 4 acres, bordered by dense woods on 3 sides, and a tangled orchard to the west. The garden behind the house was a wild tangle of brambles and roses, the stone paths nearly swallowed by weeds. Statues, their features worn smooth by time, stood sentinel among the overgrowth. I wandered the perimeter, breathing in the crisp air, trying to imagine what the place must have looked like in its prime, at the northern edge of the property. I found a break in the tree line, a narrow, overgrown path leading into the woods. The air grew cooler as I followed it, the canopy above thickening until the sunlight was little more than a suggestion. After a few minutes, I emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a stone structure, squat and weathered, its entrance blocked by a rusted iron gate. Above the gate, a name was carved in the stone: Ashcroft, 1891. A family crypt. I peered through the bars, but the interior was lost in shadow. I made a mental note to return with a flashlight. As I turned to leave, something glinted in the underbrush. Kneeling, I brushed aside the leaves and found a small silver locket, tarnished and cold. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl, her eyes solemn, her hair in ringlets. On the back, an inscription, "To M, with love." Some things must remain hidden. I slipped the locket into my pocket, unsettled by the message. Back at the house, I spent the afternoon cleaning the sunroom, trying to make it feel like my own. But my thoughts kept drifting to the crypt, the locket, and the footsteps in the attic. As dusk fell, the house seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening in the corners of every room. I made dinner, ate in silence, and tried to lose myself in a book, but the words swam before my eyes. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone were knocking on the walls from the inside. I lay in bed, covers pulled to my chin, listening as the sounds moved from the attic to the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, every muscle tense, until the noises faded and silence returned. The next morning, I resolved to investigate the attic in daylight. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, I climbed the narrow stairs. The air was thick with dust, motes swirling in the beam of my light. I made my way to the small door in the far corner, the padlock now hanging open. Inside was a cramped space, lined with shelves, each one crowded with leather-bound journals, their spines cracked and faded. I pulled one at random, the cover embossed with the initials EA. The handwriting inside was elegant, looping across the yellowed pages. The entries began in 1891, the year carved on the crypt. The first pages were filled with mundane details, whether visitors, repairs to the house. But as I read on, the tone shifted. The writer spoke of strange dreams, of voices in the night, of a presence in the woods that watched from the shadows. One entry caught my eye. December 21st. The boundary must be maintained. The old ways are not enough. I fear what waits beyond. The trees. The words sent a chill through me. I flipped through more journals, finding similar references, rituals, boundaries, warnings about the woods. The last entry in the most recent journal was dated 1973. The house is empty now. The arrangement is broken. God forgive us. I spent hours in the attic, reading, piecing together the fragments of the Ashcroft family's history. It became clear that something had happened here, something the family had tried to contain or conceal. The crypt, the locket, the journals all pointed to a secret buried deep in the house and the land around it. As the sun set, I returned the journals to their shelves and made my way downstairs. The house felt different now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I tried to sleep, but the dreams came quickly. Children's voices calling from the woods, the sound of footsteps on the attic floor, and always, the scent of rotting apples. When I woke, the locket was on my nightstand, open to the photograph of the solemnite girl. I hadn't put it there. The locket's presence on my nightstand unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I tried to recall if I'd absent-mindedly set it there before bed, but the memory wouldn't come. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the inscription with my thumb. The girl's eyes in the photograph seemed to follow me, her expression unreadable. I slipped the locket into my pocket, determined to keep it with me until I could learn more. That morning, I decided to visit the small town nearby. I needed supplies, but more than that, I wanted to see if anyone knew anything about the Ashcroft family or the house's history. The town was little more than a cluster of shops around a square, with a diner, a hardware store, and a library that looked as old as the house itself. The librarian, a woman with sharp eyes and a gentle voice, perked up when I mentioned the Ashcroft estate. "You're living out there?" she asked, her tone a mix of surprise and concern. "Not many stay long. The place has a reputation, you know. Folks say it's cursed, or haunted, depending on who you ask." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "If you want to know more, you should talk to Mr. Grady. He's the town historian. His shop's just across the street." Mr. Grady's shop was a cluttered maze of antiques and local memorabilia. He was a wiry man with a shock of white hair and a habit of tapping his fingers on the counter as he spoke. When I told him where I was living, his eyes widened. "The Ashcroft place, eh? Haven't heard that name in years. My grandmother used to tell stories about that house. Said it was built on old ground, land the locals wouldn't touch. The Ashcrofts were always a strange lot kept to themselves. Never came to town more than they had to. I asked about the crypt in the woods, and he nodded slowly. Family plot. But there's more to it. Some say the Ashcrofts made a bargain, something to do with the land. After the last of them left, nobody wanted the place. Too many stories. Too many disappearances. He paused, studying me. You be careful out there. Some things are better left alone. I thanked him and left, my mind racing with questions. Back at the house, I spent the afternoon in the library, poring over the journals I'd found in the attic. The entries were fragmented, but a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, the same phrases appeared. The arrangement, the boundary, the price. There were references to rituals performed on the winter solstice, offerings left at the edge of the woods, and warnings never to disturb the crypt. One journal, dated 1924, described a particularly harsh winter. The writer, a woman named Margaret Ashcroft, wrote of hearing children's voices outside her window at night, of finding small footprints in the snow that led from the woods to the house and back again. She spoke of dreams filled with laughter and weeping, and of a sense of dread that grew with each passing day. The arrangement must be kept, she wrote. If we fail, the boundary will break, and what waits in the woods will come for us all. That night I dreamed of the girl in the locket. She stood at the edge of the woods, her dress fluttering in a wind I couldn't feel. She raised her hand, beckoning me closer, her eyes dark and hollow. I woke with a start, the taste of apples thick in my mouth. The next day, I returned to the crypt, this time with a flashlight and a crowbar. The gate groaned as I forced it open, the sound echoing through the trees. Inside, the air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and stone. The walls were lined with niches, each marked with a name and a date. In the center stood a stone sarcophagus, its lid carved with the same symbol I'd seen in the journals, a circle with a line through it. I ran my fingers over the carving, feeling the chill seep into my skin. At the foot of the sarcophagus, I found a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked and brittle. Inside, the handwriting was different, tighter, more hurried. The entries were brief, almost frantic. The boundary weakens. The arrangement must be renewed. Blood is required. The woods are restless. As I read, a cold wind swept through the crypt, extinguishing my flashlight. I fumbled in the darkness, heart pounding, until the beam flickered back to life. I hurried out, the book clutched to my chest, and didn't stop until I reached the house. That evening, as I sat in the library, the house seemed to close in around me. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere upstairs, a door slammed shut. I opened the leather-bound book, determined to learn what the Ashcrofts had tried so hard to hide. The first page was a warning, written in a shaky hand. If you read this, know that the price is never paid in full. The debt endures. The boundary must hold. I read late into the night, the words blurring as exhaustion overtook me. When I finally slept, I dreamed of the woods, of voices calling my name, and of the girl in the locket, waiting just beyond the trees. The next morning, I woke to a house shrouded in fog. The world outside my window was a blur of gray. The trees, at the edge of the property, little more than shadows. I felt the weight of the previous night's reading pressing on me, the warnings from the journals echoing in my mind. The phrase, "the price is never paid in full," repeated itself with every step I took through the silent halls. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The leather-bound book opened before me. The entries grew more desperate as the pages went. On the writer, whose initials, H.A., matched a name I'd seen in the cryptoscribed rituals performed at the solstice. Offerings of bread, milk, and sometimes blood, left at the boundary stones in the woods. There were mentions of a watcher who appeared in dreams, always taking the form of a child, with dark eyes and a solemn face. I decided I needed to see the boundary stones for myself. The fog clung to the ground as I made my way into the woods, the air damp and cold. I followed the path past the crypt, deeper into the trees than I'd gone before. After a while, I found the first stone, a squat, moss-covered marker, its surface carved with the same circle and line symbol. I walked the perimeter, finding 6 more stones, each one placed at a point that seemed to form a rough circle around the property. At the last stone, I found something new, a small pile of objects, carefully arranged, a child's shoe, a broken doll, a handful of marbles, offerings perhaps, or tokens left by someone who'd come before me. I knelt to examine them, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. As I stood, I heard a faint sound behind me, laughter, high and thin, drifting through the trees. I spun around, but saw only fog and shadows. Back at the house, I tried to focus on my work, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. Every time I glanced at a window, I half expected to see a face peering in from the mist. The locket, which I'd left on my desk, was now closed, though I was certain I'd left it open. I opened it again, studying the girl's face, searching for some clue in her expression. That afternoon, I drove into town, hoping for a distraction. At the library, the librarian greeted me with a knowing look. "You've been reading the old records, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded, and she led me to a back room filled with dusty boxes and yellowed newspapers. Together, we sifted through the archives, piecing together the Ashcroft family's history. The story that emerged was one of tragedy and isolation. The Ashcrofts had arrived in the area in the late 1800s, building their grand house on land that locals avoided. There were rumors of a mining accident, of children lost in the woods, of strange lights seen on winter nights. The family had always kept to themselves, and after the last Ashcroft left in the 1970s, the house stood empty for decades. One article, dated December 23, 1891, caught my eye. The headline read, "Tragedy at Ashcroft Estate Child, Lost in the Woods." The story described a search for a young girl, Margaret Ashcroft, who had vanished during a winter storm. Her body was never found. The article mentioned that the family held a private ceremony at the crypt, and that afterward, the estate was closed to visitors for months. I left the library with a stack of photocopies and a growing sense of dread. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was darker than I'd imagined. The rituals, the boundary stones, the lost children all pointed to a bargain made long ago. One that demanded a price the family could never fully pay. That night the house was restless. Doors creaked open and shut, and the wind howled around the eaves. I tried to sleep, but the dreams came quickly. I was standing in the woods, surrounded by fog, the boundary stones glowing faintly in the darkness. The girl from the locket stood before me, her eyes black and endless. She reached out, her hand cold as ice, and whispered, "The debt endures." I woke with a start, the taste of earth and apples thick in my mouth. The locket was on my pillow, open to the photograph. I stared at it, heart pounding, and realized that whatever haunted this house was growing stronger. The boundary was weakening, and I was running out of time to understand what needed to be done. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I would return to the crypt, this time prepared to open the sarcophagus. If the answers I needed were buried with the Ashcrofts, I would find them no matter what the cost. The morning was cold and bright, the fog finally burned away by a pale sun. I gathered what I thought I'd need, a crowbar, gloves, a flashlight, and the leather-bound book. The woods felt different in daylight, less menacing, but still heavy with secrets. As I walked the path to the crypt, I rehearsed what I'd say if anyone from town happened upon me, prying open a century-old tomb. But the woods were silent, and I was alone. The crypt's iron gate groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder than before, the stone walls beaded with moisture. I knelt by the sarcophagus, tracing the circle landline symbol with my gloved hand. The lid was heavy, but after several minutes of straining and levering with the crowbar, it shifted. With a grinding sigh, I braced myself for the worst, but what I found was stranger than I'd imagined. Inside, instead of a body, was a bundle of objects: a child's dress, carefully folded, a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon, a small wooden box, its lid carved, with the same symbol as the stones and journals. My hands shook as I opened the box. Inside were 7 silver coins, each stamped with a different date, and a scrap of parchment covered in spidery handwriting. The note was brief: for each year, the debt is owed, a coin is given. The boundary must be renewed. Blood binds, memory endures. I turned the coins over in my palm, feeling their weight. The dates spanned decades, each one corresponding to a year mentioned in the journal's ears when the rituals had been performed, or when tragedy had struck the family. I sat on the cold stone floor, the box in my lap, and tried to make sense of it all. The journals, the offerings, the lost children. The coins, everything pointed to a cycle, a debt that had to be paid again and again. The Ashcrofts had tried to keep the boundary intact, but something had gone wrong. The arrangement had been broken, and now the responsibility had fallen to me. As I left the crypt, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on my back. The woods were silent, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I hurried back to the house, locking the doors. Behind me, I spread the coins, the note, and the locket on the dining room table, trying to piece together the ritual described in the journals. The instructions were cryptic, but a pattern emerged. On the winter solstice, offerings were to be placed at each boundary stone, and a drop of blood, freely given, was required to seal the ritual. The coins, it seemed, were tokens of the debt, meant to be left at the crypt as a final offering. The locket, with its photograph and inscription, was a reminder of what was at stake. I spent the afternoon preparing, gathering what I'd need for the ritual. I found candles in the cellar, old but still usable, and a small knife with a bone handle in a box of kitchen odds and ends. As dusk fell, I packed everything into a satchel and waited for night to come. The hours crawled by. The house was restless, the wind rattling the windows and the floorboards creaking overhead. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. At midnight, I stepped outside, the cold biting through my coat. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the lawn. I made my way to the first boundary stone, the satchel heavy on my shoulder. I placed a coin at its base, lit a candle, and whispered the words from the journal. The debt is paid, the boundary holds. I pricked my finger with the knife, letting a drop of blood fall onto the stone. The air seemed to shiver, the candle, flame flickering wildly before settling into a steady glow. I repeated the ritual at each stone, moving in a slow circle around the property. At the final stone, I hesitated. The woods pressed close, the darkness thick and impenetrable. I placed the last coin, lit the candle, and spoke the words. As my blood touched the stone, a sudden gust of wind snuffed out the flame. I stood, frozen, heart pounding, as the silence deepened. Then, from the trees, came the sound of laughter, children's laughter, high and cold, echoing through the night. I turned, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I locked every window and door. I sat in the kitchen, the satchel at my feet, and waited for dawn. The house was silent, but I knew the ritual was only a temporary fix. The debt endured, and the boundary was fragile as the first. Light crept through the windows. I realized I was no longer just a visitor in the Ashcroft House. I was its caretaker, bound by the same bargain that had haunted the family for generations. And whatever waited in the woods was not finished with me yet. The days that followed the ritual passed in a haze of exhaustion and unease. I tried to convince myself that I'd done enough, that the boundary would hold, but the house seemed to disagree. The air inside was heavier, the shadows deeper. I found myself jumping at every creak and groan, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. The locket, which I now wore around my neck, felt colder against my skin with each passing day. I tried to distract myself with work, but my thoughts kept circling back to the coins, the crypt, and the laughter in the woods. I reread the journals, searching for anything I might have missed. One entry, written in a shaky hand, caught my attention. If the laughter returns, the debt is not satisfied. Seek the watcher. Only the watcher knows the true price. The watcher. The word sent a chill through me, conjuring images of the girl from the locket, her dark eyes watching from the edge of the trees. That night, I dreamed of her again. She stood at the boundary stone, her dress fluttering in a wind that didn't touch the trees. She beckoned me closer, her voice a whisper in the darkness. You must remember, the debt is older than the house, older than the Ashcrofts. The boundary is only a line. What waits beyond is patient. I woke with a start, the taste of apples thick in my mouth, the locket burning cold against my chest. Unable to sleep, I wandered the house, flashlight in hand. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. As I passed the library, I noticed something, a faint glow coming from beneath the door. I pushed it open, heart pounding. On the desk, the journals were spread out, their pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. The candle I'd left there days ago was burning, though I was certain I hadn't lit it. I approached slowly, the air in the room colder than the rest of the house. The journals had opened to a page I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink darker, almost fresh. The watcher waits at the heart of the woods. The price must be named, the debt must be claimed. As I read, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The next morning, I resolved to find the heart of the woods. I packed a bag with water, a flashlight, and the locket, and set out along the path past the crypt. The woods were silent, the air thick with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. I followed the boundary stones, counting each one, until I reached a place where the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a kind of archway. Beyond the arch, the woods changed. The air was colder, the light dimmer. The ground sloped downward, and the trees grew older, their trunks twisted and gnarled. I walked for what felt like hours, the silence pressing in on me, until I reached a small clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, covered in moss and lichen, its surface carved with the same symbol as the coins and journals. On the altar sat a single object, a child's toy, a wooden horse, its paint faded and chipped. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed the wood, a voice whispered in my ear, "You have come to seek the watcher." I spun around, but the clearing was empty. The woods pressed close, the silence absolute. I placed the locket on the altar, hoping for some sign, some answer. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. Then, from the trees, the girl appeared. She was as I'd seen her in my dreams, solemn, dark-eyed, her dress fluttering in a wind I couldn't feel. She regarded me with an ancient sadness. "You carry the debt," she said, her voice echoing in the clearing. "You have tried to pay, but the price is not yours alone. The boundary is weak because the memory is weak. You must remember. You must make them remember." I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. "How?" I managed to whisper. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "Tell the story. Speak the names. Remember the lost. Only then will the boundary hold." She reached out, her hand cold as ice, and pressed the locket into my palm. "Do not forget." The woods seemed to sigh, the air growing warmer as the girl faded into the shadows. I stood alone in the clearing, the locket heavy in my hand, the weight of her words settling over me. I made my way back to the house, the path easier to follow now, the woods less oppressive. That night, I sat at my desk and began to write. I wrote the names from the crypt, the stories from the journals, the dreams, and the warnings. I wrote until dawn, the words pouring out of me, the boundary between past and present blurring with every page. As the sun rose, the house felt lighter, the air less heavy. The laughter in the woods was gone, replaced by a deep, peaceful silence. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt a sense of hope. The dead endured, but so did memory. And as long as I remembered, the boundary would hold. The days that followed were the quietest I'd experienced since moving in. The house, once so restless, seemed to settle into a tentative peace. I kept writing, filling page after page with the stories I'd uncovered, names, dates, dreams, and warnings. I wrote about the Ashcrofts, about the rituals and the boundary, stones about the girl in the locket and the watcher in the woods. Each word felt like a small act of defiance against the darkness that had haunted the house for so long. But peace, I learned, was fragile. One evening, as I sat in the sunroom, watching the last light fade from the sky, I heard a knock at the door. It was so unexpected that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. I hesitated, heart pounding, before crossing the foyer and opening the door. On the porch stood a woman, bundled in a heavy coat, her hair streaked with gray. She introduced herself as Mrs. Callahan, a neighbor from down the road. I heard someone had finally moved in, she said, her voice warm but wary. Thought I'd bring you a pie. It's what we do out here. She handed me a tin wrapped in a checkered cloth, her eyes flicking past me into the shadowy depths of the house. I invited her in, and we sat in the kitchen, the pie between us. She asked about the renovations, about how I was settling in. I answered as best I could, careful not to mention the rituals or the dreams. But Mrs. Callahan was sharp. You know, folks around here have always said this place was different, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. My grandmother used to tell stories about the Ashcrofts said they kept to themselves, but every winter, you'd see lights in the woods, hear singing, sometimes, children's voices, she said. Gave her the chills. I asked if she believed the stories. She shrugged, her hands wrapped around her mug. I don't know, but I do know that every family that's lived here has left in a hurry. Some say it's the isolation, others say it's something else. Just be careful. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. After she left, I sat in the kitchen, the pie untouched. Her visit had unsettled me, stirring up old fears I'd tried to bury. I wandered the house, checking the locks, peering out into the darkness. The woods were silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. That night, the dreams returned. I was in the woods again, the boundary stones glowing faintly in the moonlight. The girl stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes sad. You must finish what was started, she whispered. The story is not complete. The debt is not yet paid. I woke before dawn, the house cold and silent. I made coffee and sat at my desk, staring at the pages I'd written. What was I missing? What part of the story had I failed to tell? I flipped through the journals, searching for a clue. In one, I found a passage I'd overlooked before. The final offering is memory. To remember is to bind. To forget is to break the chain. I realized then that it wasn't enough to write the story, had to share it. The boundary was not just a line of stones or a ritual performed in the dark. It was a story, passed down through generations, a memory kept alive by those willing to remember. If the story was forgotten, the boundary would fail. I spent the next day in town, talking to anyone who would listen. I visited the library, the diner, the hardware store, sharing what I'd learned about the Ashcrofts, the rituals, the lost children. Some people listened politely. Others dismissed me as another outsider with too much time on my hands. But a few, like Mrs. Callahan, listened closely, their eyes wide with fear and understanding. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I walked the boundary stones, reciting the names from the crypt, the stories from the journals. I spoke them aloud, letting the words carry through the woods. At each stone, I left a small offering, a coin, a flower, a scrap of ribbon, of memory and gratitude. As I finished the circuit, the air grew warmer, the woods less oppressive. I felt a presence beside me, the girl from the locket, her hand in mine. "Thank you," she whispered, "for remembering." That night, I slept without dreams. The house was quiet, the woods at peace. For the first time, I felt that I belonged not just to the house, but to its story. The debt endured, but so did memory, and as long as someone remembered, the boundary would hold. The days grew shorter, the air sharper with the promise of winter. I kept up my routine, writing, tending the house, walking the boundary stones each evening. The sense of peace held, but it was a delicate thing, easily disturbed by the smallest reminder of what lay beneath the surface. Sometimes, as I passed a window, I'd catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of the woods, a flicker of white, a shadow darting between the trees. I told myself it was deer or the wind, but I always checked the locket afterward, half expecting to find the girl's photograph changed, her eyes darker, her mouth twisted in warning. One afternoon, as I was stacking firewood by the porch, a car pulled up the drive. It was a battered old sedan, the kind that looked out of place against the backdrop of the Ashcroft House. A man stepped out, tall and thin, with a weathered face and a cautious smile. He introduced himself as Tom Riley, a name that sent a jolt through me. Riley, the same as the children in the journals, the ones lost to the woods and the debt. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," he said, glancing at the house as if expecting it to bite. "My family's got a long history with this place. Thought I'd see who was living here now." We sat on the porch, the late sun slanting through the trees. Tom told me his grandmother had worked for the Ashcrofts, and that his own family had lived in a cottage on the edge of the property, long since collapsed into ruin. He asked if I'd seen anything strange, lights in the woods, voices at night. I hesitated, then told him what I could, careful to leave out the more unbelievable details. He listened, nodding, his eyes never leaving mine. "My grandmother used to say the land remembers," he said quietly. "She said the Ashcrofts made a promise, and when they broke it, the land started to take things back. People, memories, even time. That's why nobody stays here long." I asked if he believed the stories. He shrugged. "I believe something happened. My grandmother lost a brother out here, disappeared one winter, never found. She always said the woods took him, said the only way to keep safe was to remember, to tell the stories, even if nobody wanted to hear them." After Tom left, I walked the property, his words echoing in my mind. The woods were quiet, the boundary stones cold beneath my hand. I spoke the names again, louder this time, daring the silence to answer. As I finished, a gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound of children's laughter. I shivered, but it felt different, now less threatening, more like a memory echoing through the years. That night, I dreamed of the cottage Tom had mentioned. In the dream, it was whole again, smoke curling from the chimney, light spilling from the windows. Children played in the yard, their laughter bright and clear. The girl from the locket stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. She smiled, and for the first time her eyes were warm. I woke before dawn, the dream lingering like mist. I dressed and went outside, following the path Tom had described. The ruins of the cottage were little more than a pile of stones and rotted beams, half swallowed by brambles. I knelt in the frost, brushing aside leaves and dirt, searching for anything that might have survived. Beneath a flat stone, I found a small tin box. rusted but intact. Inside were a handful of marbles, a broken comb, and a scrap of paper folded many times over. The writing was faded, but I could just make out the words, "Remember us. Tell our story. The woods are hungry, but memory is stronger." I sat there for a long time, the box in my lap, the woods silent around me. Back at the house, I added the marbles and the note to my growing collection of tokens, coins, ribbons, flowers, and now these small treasures from the past. I placed them on the mantel in the library, a shrine to memory and loss. As I did, I felt the house settle around me, the air growing warmer, the shadows less insistent. That evening, as I walked the boundary stones, I felt a presence beside me. The girl from the locket, her hand in mine, her voice a whisper in the dusk. "You're doing well. The story is almost complete, but there is one more thing you must do." I asked what that was, but she only smiled, her eyes shining with something like hope. "You'll know when the time comes. Until then, remember." The woods were quiet as I returned to the house, the boundary holding, the debt at least for now kept at bay. The first snow arrived early that year, blanketing the grounds in white and muffling every sound. The house felt cocooned, insulated from the world, but the silence was not comforting. It was the kind of quiet that made you listen harder, straining for the faintest creak or whisper. I spent my days tending the fire, writing, and keeping up my ritual walks along the boundary stones, now half buried in snow. Each time I brushed the snow away from a stone, I'd find the offerings I'd left still there, undisturbed, as if the woods themselves respected the memory. One morning, I found a letter slipped under my door. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed and brittle. There was no return address, only my name written in a careful, looping script. Inside was a single sheet, the ink faded, but legible. "You are the keeper now. The story is not just yours to tell, but to live. When the solstice comes, the boundary will be tested. Remember the names, remember the promise. Do not let the fire die." There was no signature, but I recognized the handwriting from the journal's Margaret Ashcroft. The letter felt like both a warning and a benediction. I tucked it into the leather-bound book, feeling the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on my shoulders. As the solstice approached, the house grew restless again. The temperature dropped, and I often woke to find the windows frosted over from the inside, strange patterns etched in the glass circles, lines, and sometimes what looked like tiny handprints. The locket, which I now kept on the mantel with the other tokens, would sometimes swing gently on its chain, as if stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel. One night, I heard singing from the woods. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. Child's voice, clear and sweet, singing a lullaby I didn't recognize. I stood at the window, watching the snow fall, the woods dark and impenetrable. The singing faded, replaced by a hush so deep it pressed against my ears. The next day, I visited Mrs. Callahan, hoping for company and perhaps some advice. She greeted me with a hug and a mug of tea, her kitchen warm and bright. I told her about the letter, the singing, the patterns on the glass. She listened without interrupting, her face grave. "My grandmother used to say the solstice was the thin time," she said quietly. "The night when the past and present touch, when the old debts come due." She said if you keep the fire burning and remember the names, you'll be safe. But you have to mean it. You have to believe. I promised her I would. That night, I built a fire in every fireplace, the house glowing with warmth and light. I sat in the library, reading the names from the crypt, the journals, and the note from the cottage. I spoke them aloud, letting the words fill the house. Pushing back the darkness, as midnight approached, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and howling around the eaves. I walked the boundary stones, my breath steaming in the cold, the snow crunching underfoot. At each stone, I left a new offering, a sprig of holly, a silver coin, a scrap of red ribbon. I spoke the names again, louder this time, my voice echoing through the trees. At the final stone I paused, the woods pressing close. The air was electric, charged with something ancient and watchful. I closed my eyes and listened. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice. You remember. You keep the promise. I opened my eyes to find the girl from the locket standing before me, her dress white as the snow, her eyes shining. She smiled, and the woods seemed to breathe with her. The boundary holds, she whispered, but the story is not finished. There is one last thing you must do. I asked her what it was, but she only shook her head, her smile fading. You'll know. When the time comes, you'll know. I returned to the house, the fire still burning bright. I sat by the hearth, the tokens arrayed before me, and waited for dawn. The night passed without incident, the house warm and safe, but I knew the true test was still to come. As the first light crept over the horizon, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I was the keeper now, the storyteller, the one who remembered. The debt endured, but so did hope. And as long as I kept the fire burning and the story alive, the boundary would hold. The days after the solstice felt different, as if the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for so long. The snow outside sparkled in the pale winter sun, and for the first time, I found myself humming as I moved through the rooms, tending the fires and dusting the shelves. The tokens on the mantel marbles, coins, ribbons, the locket seemed to glow in the firelight, each one a small anchor to the past. But beneath the calm, I sensed a new tension, a waiting. The girl's words echoed in my mind. There is one last thing you must do. I tried to focus on the ordinary writing, reading, even baking a loaf of bread, but the feeling persisted. A gentle pressure at the back of my thoughts. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of old photographs in the library, I found a faded envelope tucked between two books. Inside were a handful of black and white photos, most of them showing the house in its early days, children playing on the porch, women in long dresses tending the garden, men in suits standing stiffly by the boundary stones. In the last photo, I recognized the girl from the locket, standing beside a woman who must have been her mother. Both wore solemn expressions, their eyes fixed on the camera as if they knew it would be important to remember. On the back of the photo was a note, in the same looping script as the letter I'd received. The last promise is the hardest. When the time comes, you must choose to stay, or the story will begin again. That night, I dreamed of the house as it once was, full of laughter and light, the rooms alive with voices. The girl led me from room to room, showing me the tokens I'd collected, the journals I'd read, the names I'd spoken. You've done well, she said, her voice soft. But the boundary is not just stones and stories. It is sacrifice. It is choosing to remember, even when it hurts. I woke before dawn, the dream lingering like a shadow. I sat by the fire, the photo in my hand, and tried to understand what was being asked of me. Was it enough to remember, to tell the story, to keep the fire burning? Or was there something more, something I hadn't yet faced? The answer came that evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, and the house filled with the blue light of dusk. I heard footsteps on the porch, soft, hesitant. I opened the door to find the girl standing there, her dress dusted with snow, her eyes shining with tears. It's time, she whispered. The story is almost finished, but you must choose. If you leave, the debt will pass to another. If you stay, the boundary will hold. But you will never be free of this place. I understood then what the Ashcrofts had faced, what every keeper before me had chosen. The house was not just a home, but a guardian, a prison, a sanctuary. To keep the boundary was to give up the world outside, to become part of the story, forever. I looked past the girl, out into the woods, where 7 small figures stood at the edge of the trees, watching. Their faces were solemn, their eyes bright, in the fading light. I thought of Tom Riley's grandmother, of Mrs. Callahan's stories, of the names in the crypt and the tokens on my mantle. I thought of the laughter and the loss, the debt and the hope. I knelt beside the girl, taking her hand in mine. "I will stay," I said, my voice steady. "I will remember. I will keep the story alive." She smiled, her tears shining like stars. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have given us peace. You have given us memory." The woods seemed to sigh, the air growing warmer, the snow melting from the branches. The 7 figures faded into the trees, their voices rising in a song that was both joyful and mournful, a farewell and a blessing. I closed the door, the weight of the choice settling over me. I was the keeper now, bound to the house and its story. The debt endured, but so did hope, and as long as I stayed, as long as I remembered, the boundary would hold. That night, I sat by the fire, the tokens arrayed before me, and wrote the final pages of the story. Outside, the woods were quiet, the snow untouched. Inside, the house was warm, the shadows gentle. I was not alone. I was part of something older and deeper than I had ever imagined. Spring came slowly to the Ashcroft house, the snow receding, in patches to reveal the first green shoots pushing through the earth. The woods, once so foreboding, now seemed to breathe with new life. Birds returned to the tangled orchard, and the air was filled with their songs. I kept to my routines, the fires, walking the boundary stones, and writing. The tokens on the mantle grew in number, a pressed wildflower, a child's marble, a faded ribbon, each one a small act of remembrance. The house felt lighter, as if it, too, was waking from a long sleep. The creaks and groans that once sounded like warnings now seemed like the contented sighs of an old friend. I found myself talking to the house as I moved through its rooms, thanking it for its shelter, its stories, and its patience. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I would hear laughter drifting from the woods, not the cold, haunting laughter of before, but something softer, almost joyful. One morning, as I dusted the library shelves, I discovered a hidden compartment behind a row of books. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the careful handwriting of Margaret Ashcroft. The final entry was dated nearly a century ago. "To whoever finds this, know that you are not alone. The burden is heavy, but it is not without purpose. We are the keepers of memory, the guardians of the boundary. As long as we remember, the debt cannot claim us. As long as we love, the darkness cannot win." I closed the journal, feeling a sense of kinship with those who had come before me. I understood now that the house, the woods, the boundary, these were not just burdens, but gifts. They were a call to remember, to honor the past, and to protect the future. The story was not just mine, but belonged to everyone who had ever lived here, everyone who had ever loved or lost. As the days grew longer, I began to see visitors at the edge of the property, curious townsfolk, children daring each other to run up the drive, even Tom Riley, who stopped by with a basket of apples from his new orchard. I welcomed them, sharing the story of the house, the boundary, and the debt. Some listened with wide eyes, others with polite skepticism, but all left with a token, a marble, a ribbon, a pressed flower to remind them that memory is a living thing. Mrs. Callahan visited often, bringing pies and stories of her own. We would sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set behind the trees, the air filled with the scent of blooming lilacs. She told me that the house seemed different now, less haunted, more at peace. I agreed, knowing that the change was not just in the house, but in me. The girl from the locket appeared less often in my dreams, but when she did, she was always smiling. Sometimes, I would see her at the edge of the woods, her dress bright in the sunlight, her eyes filled with gratitude. The 7 figures no longer watched from the shadows. Instead, I felt their presence as a gentle warmth, a reassurance that the boundary was holding. On the anniversary of my arrival, I held a small gathering at the house. Neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers came, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a story. We walked the boundary stones together, leaving offerings and speaking the names of those who had come before. We lit candles in the crypt, read passages from the journals, and shared memories, old and new, as night fell. We gathered in the library, the fire crackling in the hearth. I told the story of the Ashcroft House, of the debt and the boundary, of the power of memory and the strength of community. When I finished, there was a long silence, then a gentle applause. I looked around the room, at the faces illuminated by firelight, and felt a deep sense of belonging. The house was no longer just a place of secrets and sorrow. It was a home, a sanctuary, a living story. The debt endured, but it was no longer a curse. It was a reminder to remember, to honor, to love now. When I walk the boundary stones, I do so with gratitude. The woods are quiet, the house is warm, and the story continues. I am the keeper, but I am not alone. The boundary holds, and as long as there are those willing to remember, it always will. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more haunting mysteries from Unseen Anthology. And remember, not every door should be opened, and not every story wants to be told. Stay curious, but stay safe.